This presentation is called Jews on the Prairie. And when I conceived of it and as I began working on it, I renamed it Fiddler on the Roof meets Little House on the Prairie. So for those of you who want to think about this a little, when you think of Jewish farmers, and you're welcome to put something in the chat about this, what comes to mind? Or is that just kind of something that doesn't typically go together? But that is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about how Jews actually were involved with agriculture as immigrants and how that led them into other pieces of becoming an American. And so how I got interested in this initially was via the corner of a Kansas cornfield. I was in a hotel room going across Kansas and saw in the notes somewhere in the hotel book that there was a cemetery, an old Jewish cemetery in the corner of a cornfield. So of course I had to go find it. And this is not far from Garden City, and you can see I have an overhead view of the area and all the circles, the crop circles, and then a picture of a gravestone of one of the surviving graves at this cemetery. And I became very, very curious about why there were Jews, certainly near Garden City, Kansas, and the origin of the cemetery. And partly that led me to really understand the agricultural movements that brought Jews to the Great Plains and the Midwest in the 1870s and beyond. So here again is just showing you how literally far afield we are in this corner cemetery, which I'll tell you about a little later. Why and how did Jews come, first of all, to the prairie? And they came from the Pale of Settlement. And as you know, probably very well, and there's a picture here that for those of you who have ancestors who came from 1860s and beyond, many to the United States, the Pale of Settlement is where they came from. And there were a lot of reasons for this. Eastern European immigration at the time. Over 200,000 mostly Yiddish-speaking Jews arrived in the US in the 1880s, and it followed the assassination of the Tsar Alexander II. What happened afterwards was a series of pogroms and displacement of Jewish families, resulting in starvation, losing of land, and essentially an international crisis. The pogroms were severe. In 1881, the Kiev pogrom lasted 3 days, and it was a dangerous time and place to be Jewish. And so Jewish organizations across the world essentially were looking for ways to help the communities in the Pale of Settlement, and particularly those Jews who had been subject to the pogroms and were displaced. Among the other things that were enacted in 1882 was that Jews were forbidden to, as you can see, own property, transact business, move outside of their settlements, participate in elections. And so there was definitely a desire to leave the Pale of Settlement, and the way this was described in the US Jewish kind of publications was that the ferocity of the persecution of Jews in Russia seems to increase almost every day, sees a new edict issued against them. And so you'll see partly there was a desire to emigrate, and partly there was a desire to relocate some of these families. So there were Jewish communal organizations who were already in place, who were interested in the resettlement issue. And those included some uniquely American organizations and uniquely American groups that came together as a result of trying to deal with the refugee problem. And so Isaac Mayer Weiss, who was the head of the reform movement in the United States, wrote in his paper, American Israelite, in 1882, the civilization of those Russian Jews is in form entirely different from ours. Will they be good citizens of this country? They must become that, or we have no use for them. So the Jews who were coming were met with some concern, as other Eastern European refugees were. The Jewish community in the United States, as many of you well know, was tenuous as it was in terms of their own place in American society. And when cousins from Russia who came, who didn't speak English, who were Yiddish speakers, different from many of the earlier immigrants from German-speaking countries came, were more orthodox in their dress and religious preferences, there was some concern about how that would reflect on Jews who had already immigrated and made their way to America, or who had been here for such a long time. One of the concerns was, would the Jews who came be self-sufficient? And that really came up here. The president of the Jewish Agriculturalist Aid Society in 1901 says, "We take the unfortunate out of the overcrowded and sickly ghetto into the honorable position of a farmer who may have to rough it for a year or more, but who will soon thereafter be absolutely independent, and even after a few years may be in comparatively good circumstances." So the sentiment was, if we can give these Jews an opportunity to farm, then they will be self-sufficient and will not be a burden upon the greater community and the Jewish community, and will reflect well upon both the greater community and the Jewish community. Well, there were some issues with this. Although funding the farmers took place both from US and other organizations around the world, based from Paris to Cincinnati. And many of the organizations provided supplies and loans and eventually training. One of the biggest organizations was the Baron de Hirsch Jewish Colonization Association, that not only relocated Russian Jews to the United States, but also Canada and parts of South America as well, in order to take them away from the pogroms and the untenable life in Russia. This also happened to coincide with the passage a few decades earlier of the US Homestead Act in 1862. And this offered 160-acre parcels to, over 5 years, those who would reside on their land, build a dwelling, and improve their acreage. And so this offered the opportunity for either individuals to homestead or organizations to purchase land for then individuals to take over and homestead. It also corresponded in the United States with transcontinental transportation. So railroads were building fast and furiously during this period of time. And in addition to the land that the federal government was offering for homesteading, the railroads were also offering land for sale in order to attract individuals to develop the land near the railroads. So that was going on contemporaneously with the refugee issue. There were also other ethnic agricultural movements happening in the United States at the same time. 60 miles south of the community in the cornfield that I will mention later and showed you a photo of in the beginning was Nicodemus, Kansas, which was an African-American agricultural community developed by the so-called exodusters, the exodus of African-Americans from the South into northern communities, and in this case in Kansas, for farming. The Irish Catholic Colonization Society, not only in Minnesota, but in other places across the Midwest, similarly to Jewish organizations, purchased lands and relocated Irish Catholic immigrants into agricultural settlements, and so on and so forth. Swedish, Welsh, other other ethnic groups were doing the same kind of work as Jewish groups did. But there was another component to the Jewish agricultural situation in the United States. And this is the Am Olam colonies. This was a movement that grew alongside the Zionist movement in Russia, or actually it was founded in Odessa. And it reflected an interest in returning Jews to nature. And it was a back to the land movement. So there were chapters all over Russia and other in the Pale of Settlements. These organizations saw themselves as more secular or socialist versus religious. They were collective groups that were run by corporations and had a constitution that governed them. And so groups of immigrants started coming to the United States and purchasing land collectively to begin these Am Olam communities in the United States. And the first place they came was Sicily Island, Louisiana. And I don't know about you, but this was probably not the ideal farming location at the time for those from Russia. So the colonists who came to Sicily Island, they raised $3,000 among themselves. Then they received $1,800 from the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And first they went to St. Louis, and then they settled an area in Louisiana. This was in 1881. And they started building houses and planting corn and cotton and vegetables. And things were going well for a while. But unfortunately, in 1882, several children in the community died of malaria. And so in the spring of 1882, the entire community left Louisiana and moved to North Dakota. Quite a change in terms of both farming, weather, everything. And they began building structures and staking claims on land. Unfortunately, a prairie fire erupted, and they essentially rebuilt. They had a library, choral groups, and cooperated with neighboring farmers. They did not keep kosher. As I said, these were more socialist rather than religious in nature. In fact, they kept pigs. But this was one of the earliest cooperative collective settlements in the US. It wasn't the only one. This was where they went in the Dakota Territory. And again, farming was difficult. There were pests, there was drought, there was hail. Even though these people had chosen farming and chosen communal living, it was not easy to keep communities going. And you can see after but 3 years, both of the communities on the Dakota Territory were finished their reign, and folks left and went on to participate generally in American life, not in communal life as they had started. Another organization, another group of those who were part of the Am Olam movement, they created a new Odessa in Oregon, south of Portland. And rather than farming, initially they cut and sold timber, actually, to the railroad, which was much more profitable. They did plant vegetables and wheat, and they were able to keep themselves going for a while. But it was only about 5 years. Remember that 5 years is a very important number here, because in terms of homesteading, if there was improvement on the land, etc., after 5 years, an individual could claim that land as their own. There was some earlier squatters' rights in the US. And I do want to acknowledge that all of the land that we're speaking of was, of course, first Native American lands of very many different communities and nations. And so, but in terms of the US government's idea, before the Homestead Act, one could squat in order to claim the land. Another place that was developed was in Utah as well. In Clarion County, Utah, was another Amalum community. There were also Jewish agricultural colonies throughout the greater Midwest and also on the East Coast. So in terms of, I just want to share with you a quote about Jewish farmers in South Dakota. And this is speaking about them. Most of all, the leap from a Ukrainian shtetl to Oregon or South Dakota, the cultural leap, the economic leap, was simply too great. To quote the historian Irving Howe, what sheer will and purity of heart could do, they did, but sheer will and purity of heart was not enough. So some of these agricultural communities you might be very familiar with, and I understand that there have been presentations about Cotopaxi, Colorado, which existed for 2 years. The land was owned by an Emmanuel Saltiel, and this was again given to a community to come farm. However, this land was not suitable for farming. First of all, somebody wonderful, somebody here, and I hope you'll share in a minute, had a relative who was part of this community. It was not suitable for farming. First of all, it was at 7,000 feet. There were rocks. There was not, it was not suitable for farming in general. Kosher meat was secured from Denver, but living conditions were extremely challenging. And I just want to share with you some of the history. On one occasion, the family of Morris Memorsky was without food for 2 days. His wife was sick and the Arkansas River was swollen to such an extent that it carried destruction in its terrible course. However, it was a question of life and death. Memorsky plunged into the stream and reached the opposite shore in safety, secured the necessary provisions for his wife, and brought them back with him. This group of people actually relied during their starvation period on Jewish community of Denver to come and deliver food so that they could live. The colonists actually ended up taking jobs nearby with the railroad and with other organizations in order to bring in money. So while the agriculture failed, this was a jumping off point for immigrants to begin their own American dream. And I don't know if the individual, I think it's Gail, who is on here, who has family members who settled and pioneered in Cotopaxi, wants to say anything now.
I'm happy to.
Okay.
My great uncle was Charles Prezant, and he obviously was with the Cotopaxi Colony. His little sister was just a baby in 1882, and she was my boobie. And he's, obviously the colony broke up in 1884, and he and his family, his growing family, came to Denver. And they also established a synagogue in West Denver. And he sent, 20 years later, he sent for his little sister, who had already started her family. They were from Kavod, Ukraine. She had already started her family. She came over with her 2 kids, and that grew to 9. I had 9 aunts and uncles. My mom was the 3rd youngest. I never knew Charles Prezant, but my mom and her sisters always talked about this cousin or that cousin, who were the daughters of Charles Prezant. There's also another, I'm involved with the Jewish Genealogical Society of Colorado, and there's another woman by the name of Carol Friedman. And I found out that she's my cousin. Several years ago, the Jewish Historical Society had a dinner and it featured the Cotopaxi Colony. And so I went and I met my cousin, and Charles Prezant was her great-grandfather.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
Fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing that.
You bet.
That's wonderful. And again, as many of you know, you're in Colorado. I'm not, but Colorado was also a place where Jewish ranchers and those in meat processing and others came, and flourished in some of those businesses. But as an agricultural community, Cotopaxi was not successful, but like I said, a jumping off point.
And if I might say, Saltiel's quote unquote extended family is trying to clear his name from being a no good SOB for the treatment of the colonists and his lying to them and so on. You know, it was for example, the grocery store was company owned. So
absolutely. And again, the misrepresentation of the suitability for farming.
Right.
You know, the season was probably only ever going to be 3 months long, and that was on a hillside. So
exactly.
A place that was better for farming was Alliance, New Jersey. And this was funded by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Again, the same movement, the Amolam settlers settled in Alliance. And this is 40 miles south of Philadelphia in an area known for agriculture, actually. And initially, the settlers lived in army tents, but religious activities actually started moving into the initially socialist community. They were near centers of urban Jews, unlike many of the communities in the West, who were miles and miles away in an era before the kind of transportation we have now from other communities. And so the community members, in addition to farming, were able to capitalize on their location and built canneries and pursued other trades in order to keep the community going. And the community did flourish and thrive into the 1920s as an agricultural community. Another community was Weshler Colony. This is in the Dakotas. And the initial excitement and perhaps Pollyanna-ish view about the potential of agricultural communities led to a lot of folks reporting on their success, perhaps prematurely. So this was one of those communities in which folks visited and described the communities as flourishing, when in reality, many of them were struggling. So the Weshler Colony was in the Painted Woods, North Dakota colony. 20 families were sent near the town of Bismarck, and they were partially funded by a London charity. And the Minneapolis Jewish community helped fund and found them. And again, the idea was kind of twofold. One, let's get Jews out of urban settings and give them fresh air and opportunity. But on the other hand, it was, let's get some of these quote unquote backward Jews a little bit out of the spotlight as far as things go. So one of the experiences that has been the best documented is that of Rachel Bella Kaloff. She was born in Ukraine and had a very difficult life. Her mother died, her father remarried. It was a very challenging childhood. And she was sent to the US to marry her husband, who she'd never met. And she came originally to the East Coast and then was sent to North Dakota to meet the husband and the family. And a few years back, the memoir that she wrote in 1936 was discovered in an archive and actually published. And her accounts are unbelievable. So she wrote the memoir in Yiddish, and when she came to her husband and his parents and his brother and his brother and his wife's children, everybody was living in a tar paper shack. So basically a shack covered in tar paper, wooden roof, wooden floors, barely enough room to move around, hot in the summer because it's black paper, freezing in winter. They had to bank the outside with sod or manure in order to provide some insulation. And I just want to read to you a little bit from her story. She talks about the fact that she was living with 5 people in one of these shacks. We 5 people were not to have such spacious quarters all to ourselves. At this time, the in-laws had a flock of 12 chickens, and Abe and I had 12. There was no coop outside for the poultry, but if there had been, we would have lost the flock in short order because of the temperature would soon be going to 40 or more degrees below zero, and the chickens would have frozen to death. We needed to keep them alive in hopes of having their eggs as well as their meat later on. Each family was to keep its chickens under its bed, and the ends and sides were closed off to form a cage. Also, there was a calf which had to be accommodated inside. So this was the life she married into. At the time that she came, the family wasn't even, they'd go to bed when it became dark. They really hadn't even figured out yet how to light, how to keep their home lit in the evening. And she actually did that for them and ended up creating some Sabbath candles for the family. She says, at night, as night approached, I told the old lady, who was her mother-in-law, that I was not content to go to bed at sundown. I went outside to see what materials nature might provide for my project and soon found some partly dried mud, which I molded into a narrow container. I shaped a wick out of a scrap of rag, smeared it with butter, and placed it in the mud cup and lit it. And lo and behold, there was light. And that's how they lit their Shabbat candles. So the family farmed for a number of years, from 1894 for her till 1917. Eventually, they did build a wooden house, and their family home became the center, as it were, for any bit of Jewish life that existed. She and her husband had 9 children out there on the prairie, and then eventually they moved to Minneapolis, where she lived out the rest of her life. But it was an extremely difficult and extremely challenging existence in which she and her husband persisted. I now want to tell you about Beersheba, Kansas, because this is the community where the gravestone in the beginning is from. So it was founded and funded, unlike the others that I've spotlighted, by the founder of the American Jewish Reform Movement, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss. And he wanted to do something, as I said earlier, for the Jews who had been displaced and persecuted in Russia. And so he raised money in order to move these families to Beersheba, Kansas, which is 36 miles away from Garden City, Kansas. It was essentially in the middle of nowhere. These families were not families who were had expressed any interest in farming. They just wanted to get out of Russia. So they were sent with some Jewish ritual objects, a Sefer Torah, a shofar, tent, farming instruments, and a little livestock. And as soon as they got there, they started building a schoolhouse and a synagogue out of sod and building their own homes out of sod. And then they started farming. They started farming sorghum primarily, and also trying to create vegetable gardens and such for themselves, just to survive survive without food. And in July of this all took place in July of 1882. And they were supposedly, these families were all sound and robust looking people. And Rabbi Weiss's son actually accompanied the colonists to Kansas City, got them supplies, and then took them to Beersheba. And at first they were, relatively getting along in terms of building a community and also farming. They were welcomed by their Gentile neighbors, and cowboys came by because there was some ranching and movement of cows in the area. And they would offer things like antelope and coffee and onions and things like that out of their wagons to the settlers. But unfortunately, 2 years later, it had come to the point where many of the settlers needed to take jobs with nearby booming communities that were working in cattle, and also they were wanting to lease their lands to the cattle herders. And this was seen as an affront to the reform organization that had funded them. And so in 1884, the conflict came to a head, and the Weiss and the community decided to recall all the livestock and farming implements from the community. And the constable in 1884 has a record received of Rabbi Moses Edelhertz, a pair of oxen, 2 cows, 1 calf, 1 wagon, 1 yoke, 1 chain, 1 well bucket, shovel and churn, 12 milk pails, 2 milk buckets, hatchet and wheelbarrow, 1 pair of boots, 1 straw hat, and 1 bale of wire. So the community basically lost a lot of the supplies and materials that they were using. Nevertheless, many of the families in Beersheba made it the 5 years in order to claim ownership of their parcels of land. I will say, however, that most of the families mortgaged their land for about $200 for 160 acres and ended up settling elsewhere. Some of the settlers that we know of were very successful later on in the United States in business, in life, etc. But their experience at Beersheba was really a springboard to their life in America. It was not an end in and of itself. There is a farmer who takes care of that graveyard. There's only about 4 gravestones there, but they keep it, and it's very difficult to find, actually. But I'm glad that it is just a tiny piece of the history for those who ended up passing away and being buried there. One of the things that communities and the organizations that sponsored them learned along the way was that you couldn't just throw people onto a prairie who had no experience in farming, who hadn't owned land in their homeland, and expected them to be successful. And therefore, there began a movement to train individuals and communities in agriculture. And as you can see here, there were publications that were devoted to helping Jewish farmers be successful in their efforts. And it was published in both Yiddish and English. And not only was there publications, but there were also training. I don't know if you can identify this tool. I have the answer down below, but this was a grain binder. So there was increasing mechanization that came to farms at this time, and individuals needed to know how to use them. And so in 1894, in New Jersey, the Baron de Hirsch Society, the one that had placed people from Canada down to South America, actually founded an agricultural school in Woodbine, New Jersey. And the school was meant to educate Jewish farmers so that they could go and move into communities. Somebody's saying the word farmer doesn't exist in Yiddish, so I want to hear more about that shortly, because I do not have a working knowledge of Yiddish, so that would be great to hear more about. The Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Aid Society was also founded around that same time in 1901. And this was to train and fund individual farmers versus the communal groups that were going out. So individual farmers could go and get training so that they could be successful in their farming efforts. And in 1909, there was actually a Jewish agricultural exposition in where else? New York City, because where else would you have that? But there was quite an interest in farming, and not only in the plains and Midwest, but on the East and West Coast as well. There were a number of loans that were made to farmers in addition to training. And in 1902, they made 80 loans totaling $41,000. And the Jewish Agricultural Industrial Aid Society said it must not be assumed that every Jewish immigrant can become a farmer, but we find the percentage of success can be increased by, first, a careful selection of the persons, second, selection of suitable localities, which wasn't done previously, and third, by continuous supervision of the progress of the farmer, and proper liberality when the occasion arises. So suddenly, as the movement grew, support also grew for farmers. They were not alone. They could get training, they could get loans and support. So what is the legacy of this movement, this agricultural movement that took on a couple of different forms, both religious, socialist, that led to the immigration and participation of Jews in the US? Well, Jewish agricultural contributions. Later on, even in 1942, that refugees and individuals living on Jewish farms helped fed the US during the Depression and wartime. So that was a contribution of some of these farms. And this is a Dorothea Lange portrait of a Jewish family farming. What else is the legacy? The biggest thing was land ownership. As I said, in the case of those, especially in Beersheba, Kansas, but in other communities, there were about 7 other Jewish farming communities in Kansas at the same time. One could both become a citizenship and receive the land that would be basically the capital needed to go on to other opportunities in the US, to move and to perhaps start a business. It also prepared Jews for both the military and things like the Civilian Conservation Corps later on, in between the World War I and World War II, in which Jews were very involved in agriculture, in that movement, and in building and in related activities. So that was another piece of the legacy. The agricultural utopias didn't last very long, of course, those groups, but again, those people went on to form communities. And since you are close to my home state, I am going to share a little bit about New Mexico, which I'm sure is, of course, the same for Colorado. There were and are Jewish farmers, ranchers, and involvement in agriculture here and in the Southwest and the Midwest as well. In New Mexico, there were no organized Jewish agricultural colonies, but early on, there were women, in fact, who owned large ranches, and other Jewish farmers as well. There was also a woman who invented the pinyon nut sheller. She's shown here in the American Nut Journal with her sheller in 1918. So while she was not directly involved in the growing of the pinyons, she was involved in the production process. And so again, this is not unique to New Mexico in terms of farming and ranching. We just often have a sort of urban-centric view of Jewish life because that's where most Jews happen to come, especially initially. And so that is what I wanted to share with you today. And I'd love to have some conversation and discussion and answer any questions that you might have. And especially hear about the piece about not having a word in Yiddish for farmers. So thank you very much. I do have a list of sources and resources, and I'm also happy to send that and share it with Rebecca so that it is longer than this, so that you can get that too. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And I don't know. Oh, good. Happy to answer questions and have a conversation.
So two things. First of all, farmer in Yiddish is a poya. Well, in English, it'll be P-O-Y-E-R.
Okay.
And the other term could be used is a Grundarbeiter, somebody who works the land, more a kind of a simplistic term.
Uh-huh.
And we lived over 40 years in Texas, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Fort Worth pecan company, the Shell pecan company in the stockyards of Fort Worth that is part of a museum right now. I think it still is. I don't know if it still is. It was years ago. But the building still exists. So that kind of is very interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you
very
for
much.
sharing
This
that.
was very enlightening.
So I was curious, following that, Cleva, on the pamphlet for the Jewish farmer. I don't know if that was Hebrew or Yiddish, but it looked like the word in Hebrew said farmer, the way I read it. So it sounds like phonetically they must have created that word. Would that be an accurate description?
Well, the word is definitely Yiddish. Apoya is Yiddish. In Hebrew, it would be ikar.
I should mention real quickly as well, I didn't include it in this presentation, but naturally, that, at the same time that there was this Am Olam movement, there was also the Zionist movement, or return to the land and to Israel. And so there's the groups, while socialist in nature, used sort of biblical arguments for return to land as well.
Yes, I wanted to mention also that there is a small grave site at Cotopaxi in the larger Cotopaxi cemetery. There is a small fenced off area where I believe there were 2 children that died over those 2 years, and maybe an adult or 2. And it's really a very lovely little fenced in area. It's got a wire, a steel fence around it. It's really very nice.
Absolutely. I mean, it is heartwarming to me that many of these cemeteries are still kept long after certainly the Jewish communities have left, as is the case in Beersheba for sure.
I just want to say that, excuse me, I'm a son of a Jewish chicken farmer, and I'm familiar with various Jewish agricultural colonies that were set up by the Jewish Agricultural Society.
Were those in New Jersey or on the East Coast?
New Jersey. And there's a book on various Jewish locations of farmers that I have somewhere in my collection. My wife, I'll let her talk to her about her grandfather.
Hi.
Please.
My grandfather went into South Dakota when it was, I don't know if it was a territory at that point, homesteaded, lived in the tar shack, established himself, stayed long enough to get the title to the land, ended up with, I think about, yeah, I'm not sure about the acreage, but I think it was 50,000 acres or something. It was a huge amount of a ranch, a sheep ranch and wheat. That was over a course of about 30 or 40 years. Went into town in Newell, South Dakota, established a grocery store, a seed house where he had his own seed for planting and sold to the farmers in the area. And a hardware store, became mayor of the town of Newell, South Dakota. Got honorary PhD from the University of South Dakota, and also an honorary PhD from another university that I can't remember right now. He then also ran for Congress in the 1950s. He didn't make it, but he was appointed in the 40s or late 30s by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to various agricultural boards, and the agricultural land bank he was involved in for making loans to farmers. And he also provided the seed for Franklin Roosevelt for Hyde Park for the
Wow.
grass. So he went to Hyde Park, and Franklin Roosevelt took him in a small car around that was acclimated because he had the leg braces and everything, took him around Hyde Park and showed him the how he had planted the seed. And my grandfather was also instrumental in writing articles for agricultural publications.
What a wonderful legacy.
His name was-
Do you have, first of all, what's his name? And second of all, do you have any artifacts or, obviously you've got wonderful stories, but.
There's a whole file cabinet on him. It went to my brother. My grandfather was named Sam Bober, and he had quite a heritage there in history in the South Dakota area. So that's the story. And I don't know if I have any other physical artifacts, because I think they're at my brother's house in the DC area, actually.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as many Jews did, but it sounds like he really did it, became quite a pillar of the community and used his expertise to really develop the community, both as an elected official, but also selling the seed and having other ways of contributing in agricultural articles and things like that. So
it was great. And the other thing he did that I forgot to mention, he brought in various drought resistant wheat products and seeds from Europe. He went to Europe to get them and introduced them into the West. So he did that. And is there anything else that he did with Roosevelt? Or
I can't remember.
I know he was on some of their boards.
He was also involved with the Eisenhower administration, the Farm Bureau.
Yeah.
Cool.
And other than physical artifacts, documents, I'm not sure if I'll have to inquire with my brother what's left of all that. We also had relatives that were in, that I don't know very well, but were in northern Colorado who were ranchers, part of the Karsh family. And I'm not too familiar with them, but I did meet them on one occasion. They did have cattle ranches out there.
well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and please, as somebody who digs through histories and is so excited to find, the pieces of history, to find a way to record your stories, in whatever way you do that, whether it be writing or video or anything. I mean, if this memoir that I read from hadn't have been found, that would have been lost to history. So please share your stories. I just encourage you to do that.